Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Goblins and Growlers Podcast. I'm Josh Maltby at Black Cloak DM.
I'm Brandon Dingus at Way of Brandalore on various places. Josh, I'm very excited about today's episode.
I am also very excited about today's episode
because we've got a very exciting episode, and they're all great, and I love all of them. But I'm just very excited about this one because in our continuing quest to be a more professional organization, we actually have a correspondence report. GenCon, as of our recording of this, was last weekend, and we sent a correspondent to GenCon, and they had a wonderful time. And right now they're back with us to tell us everything that happened. Obviously we're talking about Josh, and Josh can talk about his travails of getting to Indianapolis and getting back and all the stuff that he had to do while he was there. But it's really exciting because we actually ended up with more access than people would normally have. So Josh was able to connect with a bunch of industry folks and have some conversations. And we think it's just really worthwhile to be able to share it here today. And I don't want to necessarily steal Josh's thunder because I can tell he's like bubbling, just ready to talk about this. But I'll preface it by saying, we've got a lot of sort of general stuff that Josh is going to report on and some of the bigger name stuff, but he was also able to talk with a whole lot of indie people. And what I think we're going to do, Josh and I have been talking about that this morning while we've been getting ready to record, is we're going to do several separate recordings after this, and we'll roll out some of those deeper dives into the indie stuff on the Patreon. So we'll be throwing links down there for that, and we'll plan on doing that for video and audio.
We also, for some of the indie folks, I don't want to get too deep into it because ideally I'd like these folks to come on the show and talk about their stuff themselves. Mm-hmm. Literally everything I talk about today, nothing can be exact quotes. At no point was I wearing a recorder. So Everything is going to be paraphrased through my memory, which I'm going to be totally honest, I've never been good at getting exact quotes. I've been great at getting the gist of things.
Josh, I think I know we want to sort of get into the nitty gritty of everything, but I really just want to hear sort of your travel log of actually, number one, getting to Indy, and then how you, like the 4 hours of sleep that you survived on for the 3 or 4 days that you were out there.
I got a little more than 4 hours of sleep. I did follow I think it was more like the 6-3-1 rule for the entirety of Gen Con. Mm-hmm. I think it's supposed to be the 7-3-1 rule, where it's 7 hours of sleep, 3 meals a day, and a shower. I think I averaged about 6. I did on one day. So quick recap. Last episode had COVID and was unable to record. You may recognize that for me to have had COVID during the recording of the last episode and then go to Gen Con must have been immediately after being no longer contagious from COVID. I did still have side effects, such as a lingering slight cough, and additionally the old COVID brain fog, which let me tell you was a ton of fun, both while driving and while going to networking events.
I feel the need to clarify, like, even though you had COVID, by the time that you went to Gen Con, you had been in the clear testing window of COVID for the appropriate required amount of time.
I had done the negative testing battery to make sure that I was fully no longer contagious. I also, CDC guidelines say that 10 days beyond the point where you're starting to show symptoms is typically where you're going to no longer be contagious. I was going to Gen Con closer to like 14 days after I started to show symptoms. So there's no way I was still infectious. I was just still dealing with the after effects.
Mm-hmm. I just felt that was really important to clarify.
That is totally reasonable. I would not, as sad as I would have been, I would not have gone to Gen Con even a little bit if I had still been having COVID actively. Mm-hmm. So the trip there, we got up at 7 a.m. I gathered together with Brave, who some folks might recognize from the Discord, and Chapman, who some folks might recognize from Quid Pro Roll. And the three of us in a rented car drove from Richmond, Virginia to Indianapolis, Indiana, which is about a 10-hour drive.
Yeah.
Depending on traffic. Obviously we made a few stops on the way, but like it was pretty much just straight driving. We did
That's
all
insane.
take turns.
I'm just going to interrupt you for a minute and just say that's insane. I used to live about 30-40 minutes north of Indianapolis. So I know, like, once you sort of get past, and you guys probably went the southern route, didn't you, through Kentucky?
Actually we went West Virginia.
Okay. Okay, so you went like over through Ohio, Route 50, like Route 52. Did you go up to Columbus and then go west?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
That's precisely what we did.
I've made that drive several times too, from Charleston to Indianapolis, going that exact route. And I know how terrible it is once you get west of Columbus, just how flat and featureless everything is.
It reminded me a lot of when I was learning to drive in Colorado, the plains of Colorado, which are only very slightly more interesting than the plains of Kansas.
Anyways, please continue.
So the drive itself was largely uneventful. I did at least have wonderful company, so that was nice. Getting there, downtown Indianapolis is a pretty bustling place on average, I would say. And it seemed like GenCon was just really contracting down on that. There were tons of cars. Everybody's trying to find parking. Fortunately, we were able to park at the hotel we were staying at. And then that first day, I almost immediately after getting to Indianapolis, literally was like, oh, it's almost 7 o'clock. It's time to get over to this first networking event. So I got enough of an opportunity to use the bathroom and freshen up a little bit, and then immediately to the networking event. That first night was the D&D creators event. And so there was a ton of people there, a lot of very cool individuals. Elise Resendez of Mythic Grove Studios, Jarrett Butler of Dice Dungeons, Mike Hollick and Lucas of Mage Hand Press, and Griffin of the Griffin Saddlebag were all there, and were all people that I spent a little bit of time talking to. I was really excited to not only be at an event like that, because I think we guest at cons, so sometimes we get access to some of these folks, but this was like a who's who of TTRPG content. Yeah.
It was kind of similar when several of us were at PAX Unplugged last year. We got into like a couple of industry mixer events, like one major one, and then also we were just introduced to some folks in sort of the dungeons of the Greater Philadelphia Convention Center. And it was cool. It's cool to have access. It's cool to be part of a club and feel like you're seeing stuff that other people aren't.
I got to speak briefly with Duke of One Shot Questers and tell him how inspired the Paladin of Throwing It Back is. To which he told me that the only official version of the Paladin of Throwing It Back is on the One Shot Questers Patreon. If you get it anywhere else, it's unofficial.
Josh was in our G&G owners Discord at like 1 a.m. every night, like posting like a 4 or 5 bullet point update of like, well, here's what I did. I have to go pass out now.
To be honest, I was usually sending that on the way back to the hotel room from whatever the event was, so that I wouldn't lose track of stuff, because the COVID brain fog is real and it is a problem. And I was dealing with it the entire time I was there.
I just like
I can't lose any of these names.
I love the idea that we sent Mr. Magoo to Indianapolis to do all this.
So that first night was a ton of fun. Got to meet a bunch of people, got to talk with a bunch of people. Some of those conversations I'm going to save for Patreon, because they're more like, it's more like, what is it like to run a TTRPG business? Which I think is of significant interest to the people on our Patreon, but maybe not so much the folks that are on our main feed.
Right.
The things I will talk about that were conversations that occurred that night. I did get to meet Jess Lanzillo, the head of, I really hope I pronounced that last name right, the head of D&D at Wizards of the Coast. And while she was surrounded by 3 PR people for Wizards of the Coast, I was like, I want to ask you a question. And if I'm not allowed to ask this question, that's okay. Shut me down. And she said, well, the PR people will shut either of us down if we get out of line. I was like, perfect, great. Is Wizards of the Coast considering making it so that your friendly local gaming store can get the same digital book benefit that the D&D Beyond website gets? Like a QR code or something like that in the back of the book.
Right.
And she said, short answer, yes, 100%.
Okay. So
long answer.
The J in Joshua J. Maltby stands for journalist now.
She said the long answer is there's a lot of moving parts that are involved in that, such as getting distributors on board, that they have not yet worked out and figured out how to make work. There's an active concern about if they have the codes be part of the book, and then someone figures out how to reverse engineer it, then they just start pirating the codes on the internet, and then people who are buying the books don't actually get the benefit because the pirates have already stolen them all.
Yeah, it's like I can see a situation too where like not all these books are shrink wrapped. Somebody can go in, just scan the QR, and like I guess it would be relatively easy to make single use QRs. You would just say it would probably be a sticker situation that you just have to print after the book and then you slap them in there. Probably the better solution, like the only workable solution I can think of there without, you know, like a different technology than a QR or something like that, is have the FLGS owners essentially issued a separate thing with all the codes, with codes for every book that they get, and then as soon as the person purchases the book, they can like hand them the QR from under the counter or something.
That was one of the things that she outlined as being a possibility, but she also pointed out that the problem with that as a concept is making sure that the distributor, the company that's actually getting the books to your FLGS, that they are issuing those codes correctly and in the correct quantities. And it's like, that is a bit of a nightmare. I won't lie. I think the only place I've seen do that effectively is GameStop, because GameStop will give you essentially CD keys that are generated at the same time as your product is purchased on your receipt. And then you go home and you punch in that CD key immediately. And that's just that done deal.
Some sort of tie-in with the point of sale system.
Right. And that, I imagine, is impossible for Wizards of the Coast because they don't own every building that this stuff's going into.
Well, yeah, and there's just so much variability on POS from retailer to retailer that there's no way that they could just have like a blanket solution for that.
No. So she said, yes, that is something they're trying to puzzle out. They have not yet found a solution for it. And she said the big thing that makes it so that it's hard to follow through on that is she can't prioritize that, which would be a very small amount of added revenue, over creation of new content, which is a lot of added revenue. And it's like, you know what? That makes perfect sense. That is perfectly reasonable and sensible.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, but it's a question of, like, I understand the revenue argument, right? But it's also a question of fidelity to your customers, of fidelity to the people who play D&D and making it easy for them to have the same opportunities as people who are buying on D&D Beyond. And it's also fidelity to your distributors. It's fidelity to the friendly local gaming stores. Like, they should be, personally, I feel like they should be bending over backwards to make something like this work for them, because those are the people who are running Adventurers League. Those are the people who are, you know, doing stuff like Alpha does with like DMMD. Those are the people creating the culture for D&D and just tabletop role playing in general. And Wizards needs to be just breaking their back to make this work to support them. So I can totally understand what she's saying about the revenue argument, because you just have to look at like where, especially with all the trouble that Hasbro as a parent company is having, since like Wizards is basically the only profitable thing they've got going now, because they sold off their entertainment division. and Toys and Games is underperforming, and like Wizards is basically carrying the company, and the long tail of that BG3 revenue is waning and waning and waning, so they can't count on that forever. So yeah, I guess my whole answer to that is yes, but
I mean, I'm inclined to generally agree. I think in this particular instance, I'm talking to one individual who has a lot of authority, yes,
right,
but is not going to have all the answers. So
yeah, that's like, well, I was only talking to one individual about, you know, U.S. military defense policy. They happen to be the Secretary of Defense, but it's just one individual.
More my point is, if there is something where they're like, we're pretty close to a breakthrough, but we don't have it yet, I don't know that she would have that.
I'm just imagining a bunch of people at like WotC headquarters, like in lab coats,
yeah,
with a bunch of beakers and stuff, like pouring chemicals. Like we're very, it's like that. It's like when in the Who Shot Mr. Burns. No, it wasn't Who Shot Mr. Burns, but it was like a future looking scene of The Simpsons, and Mr. Burns had been killed by like 17 stab wounds, and an older Smithers was like talking to his frozen body. He's like, "Don't worry, sir, we're working on a cure." And then Frank is in the background. He's like, "We're up to 15."
The other big conversation that I got to have that I want to get into on main feed is I got to talk to Alexander Stangroom, the COO of Kobold Press.
Yeah, please tell the story about how you found out that he was the COO.
So our lawyer friend Noah Downs introduced me and was like, "Oh, this is Alexander. He's with Kobold Press." And I was like, "Oh, lovely to meet you." And Noah goes, "Yeah, Josh has a TTRPG news podcast you should listen to called the Goblins and Growlers Podcast." And I was like, "Don't tell this man to listen to that show. He's going to open that show up and he's going to hear me rant one time and he's going to be like, I don't want to listen to this anymore." I didn't find out until about 3 or 4 minutes into the conversation that Alexander is the COO of Kobold Press and not like a lead designer or something like that. So at the point that I said, don't have this man listen to the show, Alexander was like, "Oh, why is that?" And I was like, let's just say I've had some pretty strong feelings on there about the Black Flag reference document and how similar it is to 5e. And I referred to it multiple times as Kobold Press's SRD. And after 2 or 3 of this, he was like, "Hold on, let me back you up just a second right there. It's the Black Flag reference document. The system reference document is a Wizards of the Coast thing, and that's not what we're doing." And I was like, I realize now that I was pulling a Band-Aid, and I apologize for that.
Well, yeah, but also like system reference document can apply to many things if you use it lowercase. Like, he was correcting you on a marketing point, not a reality point, I think.
I think that's fair, but yeah. I did want to highlight that if you're ever talking to the COO of Kobold Press, he's going to want to hear BFRD, not SRD.
Yeah. What else did he say?
I highlighted that I thought I wanted to know how Tov was doing, which apparently he'd never heard anyone refer to it that way. He'd heard TOV before, but never Tov. And I was like, but there's this vowel right there in the middle.
He's not connected enough to the culture.
I'm frequently inventing new ways to say things, so that could also just be a me thing. He was talking about how Tov's doing well. He's excited to get more stuff in the D&D Beyond store. Apparently, they've got a deal where they are actively planning to get more stuff in the D&D Beyond store, which is kind of cool. We got to talking about why the BFRD is not more different from the 5e SRD. And the big thing that he highlighted was that despite what people say, the BFRD was never supposed to be hugely different from the 5e SRD.
I got to clarify for anybody listening or watching this that I specifically did not want Josh telling me about any of these conversations before we got on here because I wanted to have genuine reactions. So I am just sitting here like hungry for this explanation.
He said that first and foremost, it was a way to keep 5e alive, but still within OGL bounds. Second off, I believe the exact words I used were, without censoring myself, there was a point during the OGL where a bunch of people were like, man, F WotC. And he was like, well, we were never like, man, F WotC. Part of that is my wife works there. And I was like, oh. And then part of that was, he was like, look, we still want to have a good working relationship with that company. The big thing was we didn't want 5e to vanish in the wind and all of this stuff that everybody's worked on become unusable. So we always wanted something that was basically 5e, but different enough that we could keep it. Then he additionally added on to this, because I can see, Brandon, you're like, I don't know that I like that explanation.
It's not that I don't. It's not that I don't like the explanation. I think it's a perfectly fine explanation. But the cynic or realist in me, take your pick on which descriptor you want to use, can't help but, you know, put that in the same kind of category as like a Monday morning quarterback analysis. You know?
Fair. The other thing that he stated, because I was like, I imagine also that no one was anticipating that WotC, in being like, oh, you know what, we messed up, let's walk this back, would put it into the Creative Commons, which changes the entire environment. And he said that is a factor, yes, but the biggest factor was when they got their design team working on remaking things and redesigning, they realized that they don't have nearly a large enough design team to do a full system rehaul. And he said that's part of why they started working on Tales of the Valiant, was because they needed the income stream to pay people to do the hard work of redesigning large portions of the system.
Okay. Now that makes sense. That makes sense. I'm always a sucker for an admission of weakness from a person in power. And he's like, oh yeah, like if he's saying like, yeah, we took a look at it and realized that was entirely outside of our power to do at this point in time.
They started working on it, and then we're like, oh my God, what have we gotten ourselves into?
Yeah.
Was what I inferred from what he said.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes sense. And you know, if you take him at his word on that part, then I'm much more inclined to believe what he said at the beginning, just because just because like, oh, that's actually a perfectly reasonable explanation. And I think like, how long have we been talking about making a world book for the setting that we developed like 5 years ago, right? Like, it's not that we've lost interest in doing it. It's just, it's a lift. It's a lift.
It's a big lift.
Yeah. And that's doing a setting book based around either something system neutral or the prevailing tabletop game of the day. That's not saying like, oh, we got to completely re-engineer this thing from the ground up.
Yeah, exactly. And it was honestly, that conversation I think was the most illuminating one that I had that night, because it was something that I'd been bothered by for months now. And I finally had answers from someone who could give me real answers.
Yeah. We should try and get him on the show.
I have no idea how often Alexander does things beyond show up to networking events, but if that's a possibility, I will 100% try to make it happen.
I'm like Babe Ruth over here calling my home run. Like, yeah, we should get we'll get the COO of Kobold Press on this show.
Oh man,
this show that we record remotely from spare rooms in our houses. Like, no set, nothing.
I mean, the biggest streamers in the world are operating out of spare rooms in their houses.
I know. I just come from a very professional journalistic tradition.
That's fair. That's fair. So that was kind of the highlights of night one. There's a couple of things more industry related that I'm going to get into in Patreon. But overall, super awesome time. I got to see the Session Zero starter kit from, I think that's what it's called. No, it's the Session Zero system. Apologies. Yeah. From Mythic Grove Studios. Quick footnote on that. If you go looking up the Session Zero system, you may find on their Kickstarter and things like that this used to be deeply affiliated with one Gabe Hicks. if you are familiar with TTRPG industry news deeply, as Brandon and I are, you may know that that's a little bit of a, are you sure about that kind of moment. If you go to Mythic Grove Studios' website, they have an open letter to the public about how Gabe Hicks not only is no longer involved in the project, but all of the work that he had put into the project has been removed. If you are not familiar with any of this drama, you can spend about 5 minutes Googling Gabe Hicks scandal and be completely in the loop very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. But suffice to say, it is irrelevant to Session Zero system going forward.
Exactly. I did get to see a little bit of some of the demo materials for Session Zero system. It's awesome. There's tarot-like cards that you can use for both background building and for doing character linking, so that people are already associated with each other fiasco style at the beginning of the game. Oh my gosh, there was so much in that box, and it was the first night I was there, and also the same day I did 10 hours of traveling.
That's fine.
There's a lot in there that's very cool. We're going to link the Kickstarter page, which has all the details in a way that is not me trying to remember. But suffice to say that as someone who is a strong proponent of you need to have a Session Zero in your campaign, this is something that I was like, the instant this is something I can have in my hand, I'm going to have one. Because I want to use this in every single campaign I do going forward.
Yeah, I'm excited about it because Noah has been on me about starting a project that involves using that. And finally, when I had time to look into it a little more, I was like, oh, hey, man, I actually can't buy this yet. And he's like, oh, let me see what I can do. So I'm just kind of waiting to see if he can get me a copy of it so I can start looking at it. But I'm excited that you had a chance to connect with them, though.
All right. So that's day one at GenCon. I did not set foot on the con floor at all. I went immediately from a hotel room to networking event to bed. The second day I got to go, I was there with Starship Horizons working on their bridge simulator, which was a lot of fun. After my shift, I got to go out and go on the con floor for a bit and learn that the Indianapolis Convention Center is massive, and GenCon consumes all of it and beyond.
Yeah, it's the largest tabletop convention in the United States and maybe the world, I think.
On the trip there, I'd been messaging back and forth with Noah because Noah was going to be there as well, and he was like, yeah, it's like 100,000 tickets sold, and then including exhibitors and things, we're talking about probably like 140,000 human bodies on site. And I was like, oh God, that's twice the size of the last DragonCon I went to. That's an insane number of people to be in a building like this. So I was fully expecting a lot of noise, a lot of like boisterous game playing, a lot of like chaos as you're trying to maneuver from place to place. I will say a couple of things. It was a lot quieter than I anticipated. There was almost like a reserved air. Like people were speaking in hushed tones to each other. The people playing board games would occasionally get loud, but only as like really exciting things were happening. So it would be intermittent, not constant. And oh my God, there's so many booths. The whole weekend I was trying to find Nomnivore games. I went into the con floor 4 times and did not find them once. Of course, I learned on Sunday that there's a map app that lets you not only see where people are located exactly, but it also lets you pull up that location on the map. Though even with that, we'd been looking for the Indie Press Revolution booth on Sunday just before leaving, and there was how to put this. We found it on the map and then spent about 20 minutes walking in circles trying to find it on foot. That's the kind of scale of the convention that we're talking about.
You were sending some pictures from the like merch areas and stuff like that, and it looked insane.
It's nuts.
Like, I know at GalaxyCon last year, we were all just like, lol, like David Tennant's there, and they've packed the merch room because that's where they also had the celebrities and stuff like that, and the fire marshal had to get involved and all this stuff, and there were like aerial pictures of it and how hilarious it was. But yeah, the pictures you sent from GenCon were just wild. I mean, it's crazy.
The thing is, like, it's not half as loud as you would anticipate given the number of people. Like, I expect a crowd that large to be noisy.
Yeah.
And this was more like the dull roar of a group waiting to listen to an orchestra.
Yeah.
Like,
were you saying a minute ago that like it was probably like 200,000 bodies in the city altogether or something like that?
I don't know about the city altogether, but in the convention like the square footage of the entire convention, which is the convention center, Lucas Oil Stadium, and of course the hotels that are hosting them, it sounds like it was about 140,000 people.
All right, I'm gonna just do some math here. That's crazy because, like, that is, just for context, that is 24% of the population of the entire state of Wyoming as of January of this year.
I was going to say that would be the equivalent of if 1 in every 11 people in Richmond, the entire city of Richmond, decided to go to a convention together. So
that's wild.
It is absolutely bananas how many people are there. But again, you'd expect that to be an incredibly loud environment with people talking over each other, etc. It was very reserved. It was significantly quieter than I anticipated.
Were you just drawing on your DragonCon experience for your expectations of the noise level?
Expectation of noise level and expectation. I think the big difference is that GenCon is not really an alcohol con. And DragonCon is very much an alcohol con.
Yeah, DragonCon is a bar with cosplay.
Yes, and some other things, but yes. I will say the cosplay, there was some really good cosplay, but you saw significantly fewer cosplayers than almost at any other convention I've ever been to. And I think that's just because folks are there to play board games and buy new board games and demo board games that aren't even out yet.
PAX Unplugged was exactly the same way. I was kind of surprised initially, but like, you know, it just made sense for all the reasons that you pointed out there. Like, oh, okay, that's why we're not seeing a lot of this.
Yeah, like the fandom's still there. It's just a less crafty group of the fandom.
So are we even on day 2 yet?
We are on day 2, yes.
Okay.
This is post Starship Horizon shift day 2. I got very overwhelmed by the con floor very quickly. I went and sought out Mike Hollick of Mage Hand Press because I wanted to see. He had been talking to me so much about the Valda's Spire book that they created, and I ended up walking away with the box set. So
let me say a couple things about Mike Hollick. I met Mike Hollick in December at PAX Unplugged, and I got into an industry party where he was, and he had been introduced to us earlier, and so we were catching back up with him, and he had his energy level at like 9:30 at night on like day 1 or day 2 was just wild. We had met him at the booth earlier that day, and he was jazzed about everything. And then we had some of our stuff, like our one-page dungeon things, and we were just chatting, and like the character sheets and stuff like that were shown to him. And even when he was like giving us some good criticism, like some solid feedback, like objective feedback about things, he was just so like chipper about the whole thing. He's like, oh, this is amazing. You know, here's maybe what I would do differently. I think you should reevaluate this. But we ended up just like chatting for a long time. It was wild. And then like Johan Nord came over and distracted everybody.
So that was most of day 2, because after being on the con floor for like 20 minutes, I was like, all right, I'm going to go back to my room for a bit, and I don't know what I'm going to do this evening, but I'll figure that out. And I ended up laying down to chill out and then having a nap.
Yeah.
I did not accomplish much that day. Day 3, I did a little bit more time on the con floor and a little bit more time exploring. And then we had another industry event. I might actually be getting things a little mixed up. It doesn't really matter. We went to an industry event where it was a hot dog get together. There was like a
BlizzCon at GenCon.
There was like a basement dive bar where they were serving hot dogs, and it was a bar, so there was of course drinks flowing, and I got to hang out with a bunch of people there, a couple of folks from the Mithril Canvas who haven't quite figured out what their business model looks like yet, but I picked my brain about how to print things, because we've been printing things since 2019.
Yep.
So they were like, oh, thank God, someone who knows things about printing. And I was like, yeah, here's what you need to know about printing, and like local versus national versus international. Here's like the problems with drop shipping that you may run into, but also that makes it so you don't have to hold stock, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, halfway through that conversation, they're like, yeah, we're in Burbank, California. And I was like, all right, you remember everything that I told you about your local printer? Back that up. Your local printer is probably an international printer. That is, Burbank, California is not exactly a small region for creators of a wide variety. God, I'm trying to recall. It ended up being a lot of like touching base back with multiple people I'd seen on the first night, and then having really cool conversations with them. And then we went over to celebrate the birthday of the designer of Pirate Borg. And so that was a lot of fun. Got to meet a few more people there and discuss various TTRPG projects. And then finally, the things I won't talk about much because I didn't experience them at con, despite knowing that they were there somewhere. I didn't see any panels. I didn't go to any live shows. And if those are all things that happen in the Lucas Oil Stadium, that's why, because I never set foot inside the Lucas Oil Stadium. I realized on Saturday in the late afternoon, after having eaten dinner, that the Lucas Oil Stadium had a connecting tunnel to the Indianapolis Convention Center. And I only found that out because we went in search of the food truck alley. Which is right between Lucas Oil Stadium and the Indianapolis Convention Center. The variety of things you can do there and the variety of games, the variety of people is absolutely incredible. Although if you've got 140,000 bodies in an area, that's going to generally be the case.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a couple of things I haven't talked about much because I mostly want to highlight these for later episodes, ideally. One of those, I got to meet Chris KO and also Kale of the Sigil system, which is D&D's VTT.
I'd like to call out
virtual tabletop.
The observation I made from the show notes before we started recording. And it's like Josh has a bullet point that says, got to talk to Chris KO and Kale of Sigil, comma, D&D's new VTT. And I was like, it sounds like you got to talk with Chris KO and then somebody who is a knight or something, Kale of Sigil.
I hope that that's how he identifies himself. It is I, Kale of Sigil. You know what? Actually, the whole time we were talking, I still don't know if this was a bit or not. They pronounced it Sigil. And
I've literally never heard it pronounced that way.
I understand that, and I am just now recalling this, and I'm now wondering if that is a joke, like a prank that they were playing on people who were at that networking event, or if it's really pronounced Sigil, and you and I have now been pronouncing the product wrong.
Yeah. KO and Kale clowning you.
They were great people to talk to. I would love to have them on the show. They talked about wanting to do something on video so that they can show off the system to the audience. I said, well, we are a podcast first and a video podcast second, so let's try and do both. But that I'm really hoping a lot of the people I talk to will want to come on the show and talk about their projects, because there's a lot of cool stuff out there, y'all.
You didn't get a chance to play around with the VTT at all, did you, while you were there?
I didn't. I was giving kind of a wide berth to WotC booths because they were always swarmed with huge quantities of people.
Oh yeah.
If I have an hour on the con floor, I can't spend 30 minutes of it trying to wade in through this mass of folk.
Yeah, we got really lucky at PAX Unplugged because they had the VTT demos set up like in the depths of the convention center. That was just like you had to know where it was to get there. And I think some of it was maybe, if not invitation only, it's like somebody had to like sort of vouch for you to get in there. So we were able to go in and Tess, for example, was able to play around with the VTT sort of in sandbox mode as it existed. There was a group of like 6 people who were doing some sort of one shot using it for the actual like play of it. So we didn't get to mess with that, but I knew I had it in the newsletter this month, or no, wait, this is August. I had it in the newsletter for July, which came out right at the end of July, that we'll probably see like a public beta or something for that before the end of the year. But there was the presumption that there would be a lot of interactivity for it available at GenCon. But like, given that you were in like a couple of city blocks with 24% of the population of the state of Wyoming, I can understand why you didn't want to try and fight for that.
I actually, you've awakened synapses in my mind. They were a couple of folks that I talked to on the first night. A couple of things. Thing number one, they want this to be significantly more sandbox than actual, like, they don't want it to be like Roll20's VTT
it's
or Foundry.
less of upload your map
right,
and just play with tokens on top of it. It's more of just like build a dungeon and then go through it.
Right. They said explicitly, we want this to be as sandboxy as possible, to the point where potentially you could even upload board games in here and play them in 3D space. Which, yeah, I was crushing, like, I mean, that seems like
crushing board game simulator.
It seems like a good market to capitalize on. I do imagine it would be challenging to fight something like Board Game Simulator, which is already pretty established. But they were talking about, they want it to be a toy box that you could pull your toys out. You can do whatever you want with them inside the space. And yeah, there'll be some things that are like, oh, here's a little graphic for like your mini climbing a ladder and like kind of, you know, swinging its way up there. But other than that, they want people to do basically whatever they want within the space. The other thing that they said was that they are currently in closed alpha, and that they would be releasing the closed beta in batches of something like, I think they said 2,500 people at a time in the next couple of months. So your instinct is really good. I mean,
it wasn't beta. It wasn't instinct. It was somebody else's speculation that I was just reporting, and it made perfect sense.
Their instinct is perfectly good then. Because
that's like
literally what they said.
You know, well, you'll never be able to get an answer out of anybody for this, but it would be great to just be inside the heads of some of the other VTT companies out there and just be like, like, what does this mean for us? How, like, because I mean, it almost sounds like that the WotC VTT is going to be an entirely different product, right? Like, especially if it hinges on sandbox dungeon creation, it's going to be like, I don't even think we can call it a VTT anymore. I think if that's the differentiating feature for it, I don't think it's a VTT any longer. I think it's more of just a gameplay engine. And you may argue that the differentiation there is sort of a distinction without a difference, or it's just semantic or something like that. But I think going forward, we're going to see the term VTT be less and less applicable to what WotC's doing, because the more I learn about it, the more it sounds like they're really going for sort of that quote unquote killer app of it, and I think it's going to sort of change the game in terms of online play and virtual tabletop stuff.
Yeah, well, and I think this is part of why you see things like Wizards of the Coast right now is hiring for a digital monetization manager.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so annoyed with this. The post that I saw this on was a X post that was shared on our Discord. And the X post was basically like, who's excited for, you want to get +3 for your armor? Well, just put $50 down on the table and it's yours. It's like, that's not, first of all, that's never been how D&D works, ever. Right. I can't see what moron would go into WotC and be like, all right, so here's what you do. Microtransactions for items for GMs to give their players to ruin their games.
Guys, you know D&D, right? It's that, but now it's a mobile game.
What's the matter? Don't you guys have phones?
You're in Strahd's castle and you have to buy a loot box or something.
So I was like, this is ridiculous. I don't think that's what this position's going to be for. In fact, the thing I highlighted was, I was like, the mobile, or not mobile, God, you've got me thinking about mobile now. The digital monetization strategy that they've had so far is remove microtransactions from their digital books, which is something, it's a move actually I did not like.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, that's two different, like, I would characterize those as two different things. Like, microtransactions does not equal a la carte purchase, I don't think. Because a la carte is being able to buy what you want. Microtransactions are being forced to buy what you want.
Well, I personally would categorize a la carte purchases for something like a D&D module as a subcategory of microtransactions, because you're basically saying, hey, do you want this monster or this item? Well, you could buy the book for $60 or $70 as the case may be, or you can buy the individual monster or item for the low price of $1.99. And like, at that point, it's just like on your phone when a game is like, hey, do you want the farming to speed up? Just give us $1.99.
Well, I mean, I think the terminology is applicable, like if you want to get literal about it, because yes, it is a microscopic transaction in the grand scheme of things. But I just think the philosophy behind it is different, and that's why I disagree with that characterization.
Okay, I'm willing to accept that.
Yeah,
Fair.
hit us up in the Discord if you agree with me or Josh, and tell either of us why we're right or wrong.
Or if you disagree with both of us and have your own stance that is third and separate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess so.
So basically speaking, my takeaways from GenCon. First and foremost, it's really challenging to go there and work for one organization and then also work for another organization. So doing the, like, by day I was a Starship Horizons game master, and by night I was a Goblins and Growlers networking and journalism aficionado. And like, that was incredibly challenging because it meant I had no time to do almost anything else the whole time I was there.
Right.
The other thing is, don't go there with the plan that you're going to see and do everything, because I think to do that, you would essentially need time travel capabilities.
Right.
Like, you can't be in all of the places at all of the times to see all of the things. There's too much. There's way too much. I was a little surprised by how expensive some of the food on site was. Admittedly, I'm used to convention food and pricing, but there was a point where I paid $3 for a can of Mountain Dew because I needed my fix.
Oof.
And that hurt. That hurt a lot.
That's for a can, you say, not even a bottle.
For a can, not even a bottle.
That's a shame.
Yeah,
that's a shame.
It
that's what happens
when deeply.
That's what happens when you get that far into the Midwest. You're outside the moonshine belt, and the prices for something like Mountain Dew really gets high.
Oh, I need to have just a old tree that I can knock on and leave $5 there, and then a whole jug of Mountain Dew appears.
with 3 X's on it. I think the big question that's on everybody's mind too is, while you were doing all this, what were Brave and Chapman doing?
Brave and Chapman were also working for Starship. Brave spent a significantly larger portion of time navigating the con floor and the vendors, managed to score some pretty cool merchandise. If you ask them politely on the Discord, they might share some of it with you. Chapman tried to get into a couple of different things, spent a little bit of time on the con floor, but overall, all of us were a little overwhelmed for our first time at GenCon. All of us, though, felt like this is a really cool convention. We definitely want to come back, but we want to come back with like 3 times as much free time.
Yeah, and maybe some more people.
Yeah. A couple of mild complaints from the 3 of us. One of which was Brave really wanted to do Shadowrun while we were there, and showed up at the Shadowrun room during a time when one of the groups was going to get started, was asked to see a ticket. And Brave was like, I don't have a ticket. I'm just here to play. And they're like, oh, well, you got to have a ticket. And Brave goes, well, I can see that these tables aren't full. So some people who maybe have tickets have not shown up. Can I not just go and sit and play? And they're like, no, you got to have a ticket.
That's kind of stupid.
I think that is how that group is getting compensated by GenCon situation. But it does mean that you have to do a lot. If you're going to do any kind of event related things at GenCon, you have to do a lot of advanced planning, which that's never been how I attend conventions.
Yeah.
Like I'll wander the con floor and just stumble into something that's cool.
Do you remember the last Queen City Anime Con we were at, where we tried to do signups for the games we were running? And it was just, I mean, it was retrospectively, it was a terrible decision. I think it came from a very good place, but like you're right. Very rarely do people show up to a con, who are like, okay, here's how I've planned out my day. Like there may be like one marquee thing that they want to make sure they go to, but nobody's like, all right, so I'm going to show up to this Shadowrun thing at like 2 p.m. So I'm going to go ahead and get my ticket now, because nobody wants to lock themselves into that. Most people don't, at least. You know, I say nobody, right. Obviously there were people, but the vast majority of people.
Well, here's the thing with that is you're talking about, oh, let me reserve my ticket this morning for a thing at 2 p.m. I think the way the tickets were working was, oh, I'm going to want to do Shadowrun at GenCon. It is, GenCon is happening in the end of July, beginning of August. It is now May. Let me go ahead and reserve my seat.
Yeah.
Like we're not, because it's 100,000 people. We're not talking about like day of issuing yourself a seat. We're talking about months in advance planning everything you want to go to that is going to be kind of more of an event type deal.
I like living a very structured life, but that kind of thing for a con is just not my jam.
I don't know how I would plan things out that far in advance. I don't know what I'm going to feel like doing Saturday afternoon at a convention.
Yeah. Like maybe you get a headache and you just don't want to do it, you know? Like that's irritating.
So that sort of thing, I don't blame the group that's doing it, because I assume that they're doing that for some reason. But it is the sort of thing where it's like, if you're going to go to GenCon and you really want to do a lot of like, oh, it's Shadowrun's, I think it was Shadowrun's 35th anniversary or something like that. And so it's like, oh, I want to go and play Shadowrun during Shadowrun's 35th anniversary event. If you haven't planned that significantly in advance, then you can go hang out and watch, I guess, which is a little disappointing.
Right.
Finding things and people that you're looking for. I mentioned earlier that I tried to find Omnivore games all weekend because we had seen them at TMG and had them on a panel, and it was a ton of fun. It's a real challenge.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. And sometimes you can be like, I saw a vendor in the hall yesterday that was selling this merchandise. And I want to find them again because I realized I should pick up this thing. They were generally in this area. I remember you have to start like navigating by landmarks of other booths you saw on the way there. Like, I have to take a left at the indie games board gaming with the unpainted minis. And then I have to take a right at the duck game on the corner here.
It's like a city.
It's truly, truly massive.
PAX Unplugged wasn't nearly as big in terms of the vendor hall as GenCon, but like we got lost a couple times.
Yeah. I'm usually pretty good at navigating, and the whole time I was in the convention center and wandering the floor, I was generally aware of what direction I was headed, but I couldn't tell you for the life of me where anything was or where I was going.
So are you looking forward to going back next year?
That's challenging. So as someone who's gone to DragonCon many years, and the two of them being about 4 weeks apart, I don't know that I could feasibly do both. I think I would die. But the flip side of that is I did have a lot of fun, and I did enjoy like meeting the people I got to meet, and it was a huge experience, and I learned a lot. And so it's like, I would like to go again next year, maybe. Maybe what I'll do is I'll trade off. I'll do DragonCon 1 year and GenCon the other.
All right. So like we said at the top and throughout, we've got like maybe like 4 or 5 other topics that we really want to dig into that would be like way too in the weeds for this. So we're going to go record those and throw them up on Patreon, digging into a little bit more of the indie stuff. So hop over there if you want to take a look at those. And other than that, I think it's time to tell them what they need to know, unless you have some closing thoughts.
No, I think that is my closing thoughts. Is, if you're going to go, plan ahead a lot, and be prepared to spend a lot of money, not just on things at booths, but on things like food.
Yeah.
And just like generally great atmosphere, tremendous environment, a lot of fun. Would gladly go again.
10/10 would GenCon again.
Yes.
All right. Well, if you want to ask us more questions about GenCon, you can hit us up over on the Discord, bit.ly/Goblin Discord. Josh basically lives there, so I'm sure he would be available to answer any questions. Other than that, be sure to check out our Linktree, linktr.ee/Goblins and Growlers. It has links to all our stuff, including the monthly newsletter that I put out that I have absolutely no desire to make more than monthly because it takes a lot of work to put it together.
Worth noting that newsletter is always like a 5 to 15 minute total read. Like
you're really screwing me there because I have a thing at the top where I calculate the read time, and it's usually rarely over 3 minutes.
Oh,
yeah. If you want to follow the links and get more information, you can certainly dig into it more. But I think I make it specifically.
Thinking of.
Yeah, I make it specifically so you can scan through it without having to sacrifice like a whole portion of your day for it.
I'm thinking of every time I open the newsletter and I read through it, I end up clicking at least one link and following it through and reading the story behind that as well. So I think that's where my time estimate's coming from. It's not just the newsletter. It's the newsletter plus at least one article.
And beyond that, the YouTube channel, we're trying to do more with the YouTube channel. So sign up for that. We're breathing some life back into the Patreon after hitting a little bit of a reset on it. So, give us a look there, especially as we're trying to get back in the groove on that. Quid Pro Roll, narrative play that we've been doing for about 6 years now. Maybe it'll end someday. We might have a final episode at some point.
We're closing on the campaign 1 finale rapidly, although rapidly means like 6 months from now.
So give that a listen. As you know, Josh and I are on that. And as always, about everything we've talked about, telephone, telegraph, tell a friend about the Goblins and Growlers podcast. As you are all very familiar with now, word of mouth, not only the greatest Ludacris album, but also the best way to spread the word about our podcast and Goblins and Growlers in general. Because if you're in the Richmond area, we do free public games for people. So keep that in mind as well. But yeah, tell people about it. And if you like the podcast, give us a 5-star review. If you have a friend who you sort of like, tell them to give the podcast a 5-star review. If you want to give us anything less than a 5-star review, I encourage you to go back to bit.ly/Goblin Discord and tell us what your struggle is. What's the barrier that you can't cross to give us 5 stars? And we'll try and help you out so you can ultimately give us a 5-star review on things. Shout out also to our buddy at My Lawyer Friend, Noah Downs Esquire, for hooking us up with a couple of things at GenCon. It was fantastic, and we always appreciate him weighing in. And also thanks again to him for being an break glass in case of emergency co-host on the last episode.
Which reminds me, I listened to the last episode, and you and I have to fight about Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars system at some point.
I know. People were in the Discord being like, Brandon and complaining about Fantasy Flight Games. It's like,
name a more iconic duo.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. But we're going to take a brief break and then record a couple things for the Patreon podcast feed and Patreon video. So we'll catch up with everybody later. Don't know what we're doing for the next episode yet, but boy, howdy, has Josh come back with plenty of threads that we can pull on. So we'll talk to everybody later.
Bye, y'all.